There is a kind of person who walks into a room and feels everything before anything is said. Not imagination, not assumption, but instant emotional recognition. And most of them don't even realize it's happening because what you think is being too sensitive is actually a hidden psychological system. And once you understand these six traits, you stop surviving emotions and start reading them. If you have ever felt overwhelmed by emotions that weren't spoken out loud, if you've ever known something was wrong without proof, this is going to explain why that happens. And more importantly, how it becomes a strength instead of a burden. You have felt someone else's pain before they even spoke a single word. You have walked into a room and instantly sensed that something was off, not because anyone explained it and not because there was any visible sign, but because your body reacted before your mind could even analyze the situation. A strange heaviness settled in your chest, your throat tightened slightly, and an unexplainable emotional pressure surrounded you. It felt like you were carrying something that was not yours. That experience is often misunderstood as overthinking or emotional weakness, but it is far more complex than that. It is a form of deep emotional perception that most people never consciously recognize in themselves. What makes this even more confusing is how often it gets dismissed. People may tell you that you are too sensitive, too emotional, or reading too much into things. Over time, you may start questioning your own perception of reality. But what you are experiencing is not imagination. It is a heightened awareness of emotional environments that operate below the level of spoken language. You are not reacting to words, but to emotional signals that exist in tone, energy, expression, silence, and presence. This creates a world where you feel things before they are explained, and sometimes even before they are understood by others themselves. There is something important you need to understand about this experience. What you are feeling is not random. It is not emotional instability. It is a form of internal processing that reacts to subtle changes in human behavior and emotional states. Some people move through life primarily through logic and spoken information, while others process emotional data in real time through physical and internal sensations. When you belong to the second group, your body becomes an early warning system. It detects shifts in emotional environments long before they become obvious on the surface. This is where confusion often begins, because when your internal signals are strong but untrained, you may not know how to interpret them correctly. You feel tension, but you do not know if it belongs to you or someone else. You feel heaviness, but you cannot trace its source. You feel discomfort, but you have no logical explanation for it. This gap between feeling and understanding creates emotional overload. You begin absorbing not just your own emotions, but fragments of everyone else's emotional state without realizing it. This is where emotional exhaustion quietly begins. But there is another side to this experience that is rarely explained. The same sensitivity that overwhelms you can also become a powerful form of awareness. When understood properly, it allows you to read situations with unusual clarity. You begin noticing things others miss entirely: a slight shift in tone, a change in posture, a silence that carries meaning. Your perception becomes more layered than words alone. You are no longer reacting only to what is said, but to what is felt underneath what is said. This is where emotional intelligence begins to take shape. At its core, emotional intelligence is not about being kind or overly compassionate. It is not about being soft or constantly emotionally available. It is a cognitive and psychological skill that involves recognizing emotional patterns, understanding internal reactions, and making conscious decisions based on emotional awareness. It is the ability to observe emotions without being completely controlled by them. Many people think they have emotional intelligence simply because they feel deeply. But feeling deeply is only the starting point. not the mastery. This is especially important for people who naturally absorb emotional environments. Your nervous system may already be more responsive to emotional signals than others. You may notice micro changes in energy, mood, and presence that most people completely ignore. Curious. Neuroscience suggests that certain individuals show stronger mirror responses in the brain, meaning they unconsciously simulate the emotional state of others. This can create deep connection, but it can also create confusion when boundaries are not clear. The critical distinction is this: feeling emotions and understanding emotions are not the same thing. You may feel everything intensely, but without interpretation, those feelings become overwhelming instead of useful. You absorb emotional data, but you do not always process it correctly. This is where many sensitive individuals struggle. The emotional input is high, but the internal structure to organize it is not fully developed yet. As a result, emotions start feeling like noise instead of information. The path forward is not to shut this sensitivity down, it is to refine it, to learn how to recognize what belongs to you and what does not, to separate emotional reaction from emotional truth, to pause long enough to question the source of what you are feeling. Is this mine, or did I pick it up from the environment? Is this fear, or is it someone else's fear that I have internalized? Is this exhaustion physical, or is it emotional saturation disguised as tiredness? This is where awareness begins to replace confusion. Your body stops being a place of random emotional overload and starts becoming a structured system of information. You begin to realize that your sensations are not enemies, but signals. They're not trying to harm you, they're trying to communicate something. When you stop resisting them and start interpreting them, your entire relationship with emotions changes. Over time, this creates a different kind of strength. Not emotional suppression, but emotional clarity. You do not become less sensitive, you become more precise. You start noticing patterns in yourself and in others. You begin understanding emotional dynamics instead of being consumed by them. And slowly, what once felt like emotional chaos starts turning into emotional intelligence that is grounded, stable, and deeply aware. Calm, this is where your transformation quietly begins. This precision of self-inquiry is what separates the empath who is constantly exhausted and confused by their inner emotional weather from the empath who learns to use their body as one of the most reliable instruments of perception available to any human being. Instead of being overwhelmed by sensations, they begin to interpret them. The body stops being a place of random emotional disturbance and becomes a structured feedback system. Every tightening in the chest, every shift in breathing, every sudden heaviness starts to carry meaning, but this only becomes useful when you pause before reacting. That pause is where awareness begins to form and where unconscious emotional absorption turns into conscious interpretation and understanding. The practice itself is deceptively simple, yet deeply demanding in real life. Before you act on any strong sensation, you pause for a moment. You locate the feeling precisely inside your body instead of letting it stay vague or undefined. You name it with as much clarity as possible, even if the language feels imperfect at first. Then you ask where it might have come from and what triggered it. You also question what this feeling is asking you to do or avoid. This is not overthinking or emotional rumination. It is somatic literacy, a structured way of reading the body's internal signals with awareness instead of confusion. For highly aware empaths, this becomes the foundation of all deeper self-understanding. Without it, emotions remain chaotic and overwhelming, constantly blending together without clear separation. With it, emotions begin to organize themselves into meaningful information. You stop reacting blindly to every internal shift and instead start observing them with curiosity. Over time, This builds a new kind of internal stability. You are no longer controlled by emotional waves that rise and fall without explanation. Instead, you become someone who can recognize those waves early, understand their origin, and decide how to respond rather than simply react. The second trait moves this awareness from the body into language itself. It is called effective labeling mastery, and it represents the precision of emotional language. Psychological research in emotional regulation consistently shows that naming emotions accurately changes how the brain processes them. When someone simply says, "I feel bad," the emotional experience remains vague and overwhelming. But when that same person says, "I feel a specific type of grief tied to losing emotional connection with someone I care about," the internal state begins to shift. The brain starts organizing the experience instead of being flooded by it. When emotions are labeled with accuracy, measurable changes occur in brain activity. The emotional alarm system in the brain becomes less reactive, and the reasoning areas begin to re-engage. The feeling does not disappear, but it becomes structured and easier to navigate. Highly aware empaths naturally develop this ability over time. They begin to notice that their emotional world contains far more distinctions than most people recognize. Instead of just happy or sad, they identify subtle differences like emotional fatigue, relational disappointment, anticipatory anxiety, or quiet emotional withdrawal that has not yet turned into sadness. This level of emotional precision is not overcomplication, it is clarity. Without it, emotions remain blurred and difficult to manage. You cannot explain them properly to others, and you cannot make decisions that align with your true internal state. Everything becomes reactive instead of intentional. You are forced to move through life without a reliable emotional map, constantly guessing what you are actually feeling. Highly aware empaths develop that map over time, allowing them to navigate emotional experiences with far greater accuracy and stability. This also changes how they relate to other people. Because they can name emotions with precision, they can help others do the same. Many people struggle not because they lack feelings, but because they lack language for those feelings. A highly aware empath can sit with someone in emotional confusion and slowly guide them toward clarity. Instead of fixing their problems, they help them articulate what is actually happening inside. This creates a deeper form of understanding that goes beyond sympathy and enters into true emotional recognition. This is why people often turn to empaths during emotional breakdowns or moments of confusion. It is not because they offer solutions immediately, but because they bring structure to emotional chaos. They help others feel understood in a specific way, not just generally supported. This ability to translate emotional experience into language becomes one of their most powerful social and relational strengths when it is developed consciously instead of left unconscious. The third trait is emotional boundaries, understood as architecture rather than walls. This is one of the most misunderstood aspects of empathic experience. Many people assume boundaries are about shutting others out or becoming emotionally distant. But for highly aware empaths, that approach does not work. You cannot simply stop receiving emotional input from others. Your system continues to pick up signals whether you want it to or not. A wall does not stop perception. It only prevents processing. Architecture, however, works differently. It is not about blocking experience, but organizing it. It creates structure for how emotional information enters, is held, and is released. Instead of rejecting emotions, it allows them to be processed in a controlled and conscious way. Emotional architecture acknowledges that feelings will come in, but ensures they do not spread uncontrollably through your entire internal system. It gives shape and order to what would otherwise feel overwhelming and unmanageable. At the center of this approach is a single critical question that highly aware empaths learn to ask repeatedly. Is this emotion mine to carry, or is it something I have absorbed from someone else? This question is not selfish. It is essential. Without it, emotional overload becomes inevitable. When you carry every emotional experience you encounter, your internal system becomes burdened with weight that does not belong to you. Over time, this leads to exhaustion, confusion, and emotional burnout that feels unexplainable. The empath who learns emotional architecture begins to separate experience from ownership. They can sit with someone in pain without becoming that pain. They can remain present during emotional intensity without internalizing it as their own identity. This skill allows them to stay open without collapsing under emotional pressure. It is one of the most advanced forms of emotional stability because it requires both sensitivity and separation to exist at the same time. This is the kind of awareness that allows therapists, leaders, and caregivers to remain effective in emotionally intense environments. They do not shut down their perception. Instead, they refine it so it does not overwhelm them. They remain present with others while maintaining internal clarity about what belongs to them and what does not. This balance is what prevents emotional overload while preserving deep human connection. Practically, this shows up in simple but powerful habits. It includes taking small mental pauses between emotional interactions to reset internal state. Pause. It involves regularly asking what emotions are currently active and where they originated from. It also includes recognizing which environments consistently lead to emotional merging and preparing for them consciously instead of entering them blindly. These small practices gradually build a system that protects emotional clarity without reducing emotional depth. Ultimately, emotional boundaries are not about reducing connection. They are about making connection sustainable. They allow you to remain open without becoming overwhelmed, present without becoming consumed, and compassionate without losing yourself. This is where emotional intelligence becomes something stable rather than something fragile. They have learned to ask a deeper and more disciplined question before acting on any emotional impulse. They pause and examine whether the urge to intervene is truly coming from care or whether it is coming from their own discomfort with what they are absorbing in the moment. This distinction becomes a turning point in emotional maturity because care-driven action is grounded, intentional, and stable, while discomfort-driven action is reactive, anxious, and often overwhelming. Highly aware empaths begin to notice that many of their helping behaviors are actually responses to internal tension rather than true clarity. Over time, they learn that not every emotional signal requires intervention, and not every feeling requires action. This awareness slowly changes their entire relationship with emotional environments. Instead of automatically stepping in to fix or smooth over tension, they begin to observe it first. They allow space for emotions to exist without immediately trying to resolve them. This creates a shift from emotional reactivity to emotional responsibility. They realize that not every discomfort they feel is a problem that belongs to them. Some of it is simply information passing through their system. And when they stop confusing internal discomfort with external responsibility, their emotional energy becomes more stable, more focused, and far less drained by unnecessary involvement. The fifth trait is compassionate detachment, and it represents one of the deepest paradoxes of emotional intelligence. It is the ability to be fully present with another human being's emotional experience without losing yourself in it. It is not emotional distance, and it is not coldness. It is a state of grounded presence where care exists without fusion. You are deeply aware, deeply connected, and deeply engaged, but you are not consumed by what the other person is feeling. You remain steady while still being emotionally available. This balance is what makes compassionate detachment one of the most advanced forms of emotional maturity. At first, this idea feels contradictory because many people are taught that true empathy means complete emotional merging. The belief is that to care deeply is to feel everything the other person feels as if it is your own. But this belief leads to exhaustion, confusion, and emotional overload. It creates a cycle where sensitivity becomes suffering. Compassionate detachment breaks this cycle by introducing structure into emotional connection. It allows you to stay open without dissolving your identity. It allows you to feel without losing orientation within your own emotional space. When all previous traits are developed together, this state becomes natural rather than forced. Interoceptive precision allows you to stay aware of your internal signals even in emotional intensity. Effective labeling gives you the language to understand what you are experiencing in real time. Emotional architecture provides the structure that holds emotional experience without collapse. Social pattern recognition gives you awareness of broader dynamics, so you are not blindly absorbed into them. Together, these skills create a foundation where compassionate detachment is not something you struggle to maintain, but something that naturally arises from clarity and self-awareness. This is why compassionate detachment is so powerful in real human relationships. It allows you to be deeply present without becoming emotionally overwhelmed. You can sit with someone in pain without taking that pain into your own identity. You can listen fully without losing your grounding. You can care deeply without losing your ability to think clearly or make balanced decisions. This is not emotional avoidance. It is emotional integration. It is the ability to hold both connection and separation at the same time without conflict between the two. This quality is what makes certain individuals feel profoundly safe to others, not because they are emotionally distant, but because they are emotionally stable. People sense that they can express themselves fully without overwhelming the other person. There is no fear of emotional collapse or rejection. There is simply presence, a steady, grounded presence that can hold emotional intensity without reacting unpredictably. This creates trust at a very deep level because it allows others to feel both seen and contained at the same time. However, reaching this state requires a deep internal shift in belief. Many empaths unconsciously believe that love requires self-sacrifice and that emotional closeness requires losing boundaries. They believe that to be fully connected, they must fully merge. But this often leads to emotional exhaustion and relational imbalance. Compassionate detachment challenges this belief by showing that real connection does not require self-erasure. In fact, the stronger the sense of self, the more stable and meaningful the connection becomes. As this understanding deepens, emotional relationships begin to change. You stop overextending yourself to manage other people's emotional states. You stop absorbing responsibility for feelings that are not yours. You begin to recognize that being present does not mean being overwhelmed. It means being available without collapse. This creates a new kind of emotional freedom where you can engage deeply without fear of losing yourself in the process. The sixth trait brings everything together into integration. It is called purposeful emotional contribution, and it represents the moment when emotional awareness becomes intentional action. This is where sensitivity is no longer just something that happens to you, but something you actively direct. Instead of being overwhelmed by emotional input, you begin to choose how your emotional depth is used. You move from passive experience to conscious contribution. This contribution is not limited to one role or profession. It can appear in many forms depending on the individual. For some, it may become healing work or emotional support roles. For others, it may emerge in leadership, education, creative expression, or everyday relationships. What matters is not the title or position, but the intention behind the emotional presence. It is the decision to use emotional awareness in service of something meaningful rather than letting it remain unstructured or overwhelming. At this stage, emotional sensitivity is no longer experienced as a burden. It becomes a resource, a refined tool that can be used with clarity and direction. You begin to notice emotional patterns not only in yourself, but in others and in environments. You start responding from understanding rather than reaction. You begin to bring stability into spaces that are emotionally chaotic, not by controlling them, but by being grounded within them. In the end, everything you have heard comes down to a single shift in understanding. What once felt like emotional overwhelm, confusion, or even weakness is not a flaw in your design. It is raw perception without structure, sensitivity without guidance, and awareness without training. When you begin to see it this way, the entire story changes. You are no longer someone trying to survive your own emotional depth. You are someone learning how to understand it, organize it, and live with it in a stable and conscious way. The traits you explored are not separate abilities, they are layers of the same development. The ability to notice what is happening inside your body, the ability to name what you feel with precision, the ability to create internal structure, the ability to understand patterns in people and environments, the ability to stay present without losing yourself, and the ability to contribute from clarity rather than confusion. Together, they form a complete shift from emotional reactivity to emotional awareness. What matters most is not that you feel deeply. Many people do. What matters is whether you can remain aware while you feel deeply. Whether you can observe your internal world without being controlled by it. Whether you can stay grounded in yourself while still being open to others. That is where emotional strength actually begins, not in shutting feelings down, but in learning how to hold them with clarity. And so the real takeaway is simple. Your sensitivity was never the problem. The absence of structure around it was. When awareness grows, when language becomes precise, when boundaries become clear, and when presence becomes grounded, that same sensitivity stops feeling like weight and starts becoming insight. Not something that drains you, but something that teaches you how to understand yourself and the world with greater depth and stability.